2. The Moon, AD 2044. Narrated by Dorji Swallow. There was a double knock on the alloy door. The station commander, standing with his back to the room, looking out of the window, appeared for the moment not to hear it. Then he turned, just as the knock was repeated. "Come in," he said in a flat, unwelcoming tone. The woman who entered was tall, well-built, and aged about 30. Her looks were a trifle austere, but softened slightly by the curls of her short, light brown hair. Her most striking feature was her soft, blue-grey eyes. They were beautiful, and intelligent too. "Good morning, Commander," she said in a brisk, formal voice. He waited until the door had latched, then, "You'll probably be ostracized," he told her. She shook her head slightly. "My official duty," she said. "Doctors are different, privileged in some ways on account of being not quite human in others." He watched her come further into the room, wondering, as he had before, whether she had originally joined the service because its silky uniform matched her eyes, for she could certainly have advanced more quickly elsewhere. Anyway, the uniform certainly suited her elegant slenderness. "Am I not invited to sit?" she inquired. "By all means you are, if you care to. I thought you might prefer not," he told her. She approached a chair with the half-floating step that had become second nature and let herself sink gently onto it. Without removing her gaze from his face, she pulled out a cigarette case. "Sorry," he said, and held the box from the desk towards her. She took one, let him light it for her, and blew the smoke out in a leisurely way. "Well, what is it?" he asked, with a touch of irritation. Still looking at him steadily, she said, "You know well enough what it is, Michael. It is that this will not do." He frowned. "Ellen, I'll be glad if you'll keep out of it. If there is one person on this station who is not directly involved, it is you." "Nonsense, Michael. There is not one person, but it is just because I am the least involved that I have come to talk to you. Somebody has to talk to you. You can't afford just to let the pressure go on rising while you stay in here, like Achilles sulking in his tent." "A poor simile, Ellen. I have not quarrelled with my leader. It is the rest who have quarrelled with theirs, with me." "That's not the way they see it, Michael." He turned and walked over to the window again. Standing there, with his face pale in the bright earth light, he said, "I know what they are thinking. They've shown it plainly enough. There is a pane of ice between us. The station commander is now a pariah. All the old scores have come up to the surface. I am Trun's son, the man who got there by easy preferment, for the same reason I'm still here at the age of 50, 5 years over the usual grounding age, and keeping younger men from promotion. I'm known to be in bad with half a dozen politicians and much of the top brass in the space house. Not to be trusted in my judgment because I'm an enthusiast, i.e. a man with a one-track mind. Would have been thrown out years ago if they had dared to face the outcry. Trun's son, again. And now there's this." "Michael," she said calmly, "just why are you letting this get you down? What's behind it?" He looked hard at her for a moment before he said, with a touch of suspicion, "What do you mean?" "Simply what I say. What is behind this uncharacteristic outburst? You are perfectly well aware that if you had not earned your rank, you would not be here. You'd have been harmlessly stowed away at a desk somewhere years ago. As for the rest, well, it's mostly true, but the self-pity angle isn't like you. You could simply have cashed in and lain back comfortably for life on the strength of being Trun's son, but you didn't. You took the name he left you into your hand, and you deliberately used it for a weapon. It was a good weapon, and of course it made enemies for you. So of course they maligned you. But you know, and hundreds of thousands of people know, that if you had not used it as you did, we should not be here today. There wouldn't be any British moon station, and your father would have sacrificed himself for nothing." "Self-pity," he began indignantly. "Phony self-pity," she corrected, looking at him steadily. He turned away. "Would you like to tell me what the proper feeling is when, at a time of crisis, the men you have worked with and for, men that you thought had loyalty and respect, even some affection, for you, turn icy cold and send you to Coventry? It certainly is not the time to feel pride of achievement, is it?" She let the question hang for a moment. Then, "Understanding?" she suggested. "A more sympathetic consideration of the other man's point of view, and the state of his mind, perhaps?" She paused for several seconds. "We are none of us in a normal state of mind," she went on. "There is far too much emotion compressed in this place for anyone's judgment to be quite rational. It's harder for some than for others, and we don't all have quite the same things uppermost in our minds," she added. Trun made no reply. He continued to stand with his back to her, gazing steadily out of the window. Presently, she walked across to stand beside him. The view outside was bleak. In the foreground, an utterly barren plain, a flatness broken only by various-sized chunks of rock and occasionally the rim of a small crater. The harshness of it was hard on the eyes, the lit surfaces so bright, the shadows so Stygian that if one looked at any one part too long, it dazzled and seemed to dance about. Beyond the plain, the mountains stuck up like cardboard cutouts. Eyes accustomed to the weathered mountains of earth found the sharpness, the height, the vivid jaggedness of them disturbing. Newcomers were always awed and usually frightened by them. A dead world, they always said, as they looked on the view for the first time. And they said it in hushed voices, with a feeling that they were seeing the ultimate dreadful place. Too facile, too earthbound a sensation, Trun often thought. Death implied corruption, decay, and change, but on the moon, there was nothing to corrupt, nothing that could change. There was only the impersonal savagery of nature, random, eternal, frozen and senseless, something the Greeks had glimpsed in their conception of chaos. Over the horizon to the right hung a fluorescent quarter segment of the earth, a wide wedge bounded on one side by the nightline and serrated at the base by the bare teeth of the mountains. For more than a minute, Trun gazed at its cold, misted blue light before he spoke. Then, "The idiot's delight," he said. The doctor nodded slowly. "Without doubt," she agreed. "And there we have it, don't we?" She turned away from the window and went back to the chair. "I know," she said, "or perhaps I should say, I like to think I know, what this place means to you. You fought to establish it, and then you had to fight to maintain it. It has been your job in life, the purpose of your existence, the second foothold on the outward journey. Your father died for it. You have lived for it. You have mothered, more than fathered, an ideal, and you have to learn, as mothers learn, that there has to be a weaning. Now, up there is war. It has been going on for 10 days, at God knows what cost, the worst war in history, perhaps even the last. Great cities are holes in the ground, whole countries are black ashes, seas have boiled up in vapor and fallen as lethal rain. But still, new pillars of smoke spring up, new lakes of fire spread out, and more millions of people die. The idiot's delight, you say. But to what extent are you saying that because you hate it for what it is? And to what extent are you saying it from fear that your work will be ruined? That there may come some turn of events that will drive us off the moon?" Trun walked slowly back and seated himself on a corner of the desk. "All reasons for hating war are good," he said, but some are better than others. If you hate it and want to abolish it simply because it kills people, well, there are a number of popular inventions, the car and the aeroplane, for instance, that you might do well to abolish for the same reason. It is cruel and evil to kill people, but their deaths in war are a symptom, not a cause. I hate war partly because it is stupid, which it has been for a long time, but still more because it has recently become too stupid, and too wasteful, and too dangerous. I agree. And then, too, of course, much of what it wastes could otherwise be used to further Project Space. Certainly. And why not? Here we are at last, close to the threshold of the universe, with the greatest adventure of the human race just ahead of us, and still this witless, parochial bickering goes on, getting nearer to race suicide every time it flares up. And yet, she pointed out, if it were not for the requirements of strategy, we should not be here now. He shook his head. Strategy is the ostensible reason, perhaps, but it is not the only reason. We are here because the quintessential quality of our age is that of dreams coming true. Just think of it. For centuries, we have dreamt of flying. Recently, we made that come true. We have always hankered for speed. Now we have speeds greater than we can stand. We wanted to speak to far parts of the earth. We can. We wanted to explore the sea bottom. We have. And so on and so on. And, two, we wanted the power to smash our enemies utterly. We have it. If we had truly wanted peace, we should have had that as well. But true peace has never been one of the genuine dreams. We have got little further than preaching against war in order to appease our consciences. The truly wishful dreams, the many-minded dreams, are now irresistible. They become facts. We may reach them deviously, and almost always they have an undesired obverse. We learnt to fly and carried bombs. We speed and destroy thousands of our fellow men. We broadcast, and we can lie to the whole world. We can smash our enemies, but if we do, we shall smash ourselves. And some of the dreams have pretty queer midwives, but they get born all the same. Ellen nodded slowly. And reaching for the moon was one of what you call the truly wishful dreams? Of course. For the moon, first, and then, one day, for the stars. This is a realization. But there, he pointed out of the window at the earth. Down there they are seeing us as a hateful silver crescent which they fear. That is the obverse of this particular dream. Nobody hated the moon until we reached it. For thousands of years it has been worshipped, honored and played to. Lovers sighed to it. Children cried for it. It was Isis and Diana. It was Selene, kissing her sleeping Endymion. And now we have identified it with Shiva, the destroyer. So they are hating it now, because of us, and well, they may. We have violated an ancient mystery, shattered an infinite serenity, trampled down antique myths and smeared its face with blood. That is the obverse, ugly and ignoble. Yet it is better that it should have been done at this cost than that it should not have been done at all. Most births are painful, and none are pretty. "You're very eloquent," said the doctor, a little wondering. "Aren't you, on your own subject?" "But would you be telling me, in an elaborate way, that the end justifies the means?" "I am not interested in justifying. I am simply saying that certain practices which may be unpleasant in themselves can produce results which are not. There is many a flower which would not be growing if the dung had not happened to fall where it did. The Romans built their empire with savage cruelty, but it did make European civilization possible. Because America prospered on slave labor, she was able to achieve independence and so on. And now, Because the armed forces wanted a position of strategic advantage, they have enabled us to start out into space. To you, then, this station, she waved an encompassing hand, this is simply a jumping-off place for the planets. Not simply, he told her. At present, it is a strategic outpost, but its potentialities are far more significant. Far more important, you mean? As I see it, yes. The doctor lit a cigarette and considered in silence for a few moments. Then she said, There seems to me very little doubt that most people here have a pretty accurate idea of your scale of values, Michael. It would not be news to you, I suppose. That with the exception of 3 or 4, and the astronomical section, which is starry-eyed anyway, almost nobody shares them. It would not, he said. It has not been for years, but it is only lately that it has become a matter of uncomfortable importance. Even so, millions of people can be wrong, and often have been. She nodded and went on equably. Well, suppose we take a look at it from their point of view. All the people here volunteered and were posted here as a garrison. They did not, and they do not, consider it primarily as a jumping-off place, though I suppose some of them think it may become that one day. Now, at this moment, they are seeing it as what it was established to be, a bombardment station, a strategic position from which a missile can be placed within a 5-mile circle drawn anywhere on Earth. That, they say, and quite truly say, is the reason for the station's existence and the purpose for which it is equipped. It was built, just as the other moon stations were built, to be a threat. It was hoped that they would never be used, simply because the knowledge of their existence would be an incentive to keep the peace. Well, that hope has been wiped out. God knows who or what really started this war, but it has come. And what happened? The Russian station launched a salvo of missiles. The American station began pumping out systematic bombardment. The moon, in fact, went into action. But what part did the British station play in this action? It sent off just 3 medium-weight missiles. The American station spotted that Russian freighter rocket coming in and got it with a light missile. The Russian station, and, by the look of it, one of the Russian satellites, thereupon hammered the American station, which erupted missiles for a time, both local and earthward bound, and then, suddenly, went quiet. The Russian station kept on sending missiles at intervals for a time, then it, too, went quiet. And what were we doing while all this was going on? We were sending off 3 more medium-sized missiles. And since the Russian station stopped, we have contributed another 3. 9 medium-sized missiles, our part in the war to date. Meanwhile, the real war goes on up there. And what's happening in it? Nobody knows. 1 minute's news is corrected or denied a few minutes later. There's propaganda to hearten, propaganda to dishearten. There's wishful thinking, obvious lying, clever lying, incoherence and hysteria. There may even be a few grains of truth somewhere, but nobody knows which they are. All we do know for sure is that the 2 greatest powers there have ever been are out to destroy one another with every weapon they possess. Hundreds of cities and towns must have vanished, and all the people in them. Whole continents are being scorched and ruined. Is either side winning? Can either side win? Will there be anything left? What has happened to our own country and our homes? We don't know. And we do nothing. We just sit out here and look at the earth, all calm and pearly blue, and wonder hour after hour, day after day now, what horrors are going on under the clouds. Thinking about our families and friends and what may have happened to them. The wonder to me is that so few of us, as yet, have cracked up. But I warn you, professionally, that if things go on like this, more of us will before long. Of course the men brood and become more desperate and rebellious as it goes on. Of course they ask themselves what we are here for at all, if not to be used. Why have we not fired our big missiles? Perhaps they would not count a great deal in the scale of things, but they'd be something. We'd be doing what we can. They were the reason we were sent here, so why haven't we fired them? Why didn't we fire them at the beginning, when they would have had the most effect? The other stations did. Why have we still not fired them even now? Can you tell us that? She ended, looking at him steadily. He looked back at her just as steadily. I don't plan strategy, he said. It is not my job to understand top-level decisions. I'm here to carry out the orders I receive. A very proper reply, Station Commander, commented the doctor, and went on waiting. He did not amplify, and she found the continuation thrown back on her. They tell me, she observed, that we have something like 70 major missiles with atomic warheads. It has frequently been pointed out that the earlier the big blows fall, the more effective they are in destroying the enemy's potential and in preventing retaliation. The aim, in fact, is the quick knockout. But there our missiles still rest, unused even now. Their use, Trun pointed out again, is not for us here to decide. It is possible that the first intercontinental missiles did what was required, in which case it would simply be waste to launch these. It is not impossible, either, that if they are held in reserve, there could be a point when our ability to continue the bombardment might be decisive. She shook her head. If the strategic targets have been destroyed, what is there left for decisive bombardment? These aren't weapons for use against armies in the field. What is worrying our personnel is why weren't our weapons used on the right kind of targets at the right time? Trun shrugged. This is a pointless discussion, Ellen. Even if we were able to fire without orders, what should we aim at? We've no idea which targets have been destroyed or which are only damaged. Indeed, for all we know, some of the target areas may now be occupied by our own people. If we had been needed, we should have had the orders. The doctor remained quiet for a full half-minute, making up her mind. Then she said forthrightly, I think you had better understand this, Michael. If there is not some use made of these missiles very soon, or if there is not some intelligible statement about them from HQ, you are going to have a mutiny on your hands. The commander sat quite still on the corner of the desk, looking not at her, but towards the window. Presently, as bad as that? He asked. Yes, Michael. About as bad as it can be, short of open rebellion. I wonder what they think they'll get out of that. They aren't thinking much at all. They're worried sick, frustrated, feeling desperate, and needing any kind of action to relieve the tension. So they'd like to unhorse me and poop off major atomic missiles just for the hell of it. She shook her head, looking at him unhappily. It's not exactly that, Michael. Oh dear, this is difficult. It's because a rumor has got round that they should have been sent off. She watched him as the implication came home. At length he said, with icy calmness, I see. I'm supposed to have the other Nelson touch, the blind eye. Some of them say so. A lot of the rest are beginning to wonder. There has to be a reason. Even a command officer must be supposed to have a motive for dereliction of duty amounting to high treason. Of course, Michael. Well, I'd better have it. What is it? Ellen took a deep breath. It's this. So long as we don't send those missiles, we may be safe. Once we do start sending them, we'll probably bring down retaliation, either from the Russian station, if it still exists, or from one of their satellites. Our 9 medium missiles haven't been a serious matter. Not serious enough to justify them into provoking us to use our heavies, but if we do start to use the major ones, it will almost certainly mean the end of this station. Your own view of the primary importance of the station is well known. You admitted it to me just now. So, you see, a motive can be made to appear. The American station has almost certainly gone, possibly the Russian too. If we go as well, there will no longer be anyone on what you call the threshold of the universe. But if we were able somehow to ride out the war, we should be in the sole possession of the moon, and still on the threshold, shouldn't we? Yes, you make the motive quite uncomfortably clear, he told her. But an ambition is not necessarily an obsession, you know. This is a closed community, in a high state of nervous tension. He thought for some moments. Then, can you predict? Will it produce a revolution or a mass rising? He asked her. A revolution, she said, without hesitation. Your officers will arrest you, once they have plucked up the courage. That could take a day or 2 yet. It is a pretty grim step, especially when the CO happens to be a popular figure too. She shrugged her shoulders. I must think, he said. He went round behind the desk and sat down, resting his elbows on it. The room became as quiet as the construction of the station permitted while he considered behind closed eyes. After several minutes, he opened them. If they should arrest me, he said, their next move must be to search the message files. A, to justify themselves by finding evidence against me, and B, to find out what the orders were and whether they can still be carried out. When they discover that, except for 3 sets of 3 medium missiles, no launching orders have been received, there will be a panic. Such of my officers as may have been persuaded into this will be utterly shattered. You can't just apologize to your CO for arresting him as a traitor and expect it to be left at that. There will be just one hope left. So someone more decisive than the rest will radio HQ that I have had a breakdown, or something of the kind, and request a repeat of all launching orders. When that brings nothing but a repetition of the same 3 sets of 3, they'll be really sunk. Then, I should think, there will be a split. Some of them will have cold feet and be for taking the consequences before matters get even worse. A number of men are bound to say, in for a penny, in for a pound, and want to launch the missiles anyway. Some will have swung back and argue that if HQ wanted launchings, they would have said so. So why risk a further act of wanton insubordination which will probably bring enemy reprisals anyway? Even if good sense and cold feet were to win, and I should be released, I should have lost much of my authority and prestige, and there would be a very, very sticky situation all the way round. On the whole, I think it would be easier for everyone if I were to swallow my pride and discourage my arrest by anticipating their second move. He paused, contemplating the doctor. As you know, Ellen, it is not a habit of mine to reflect aloud in this manner, but I think it would do no harm if some idea of the probable results of my arrest were to filter round. Don't you agree? She nodded without speaking. He got up from the desk. I shall now send for Sub-Commander Reeves, and I think we will have Sub-Commander Calmore as well, and explain to them with as little loss of face as possible that, the chances of war being what they are, and the chances of leakage now being nil, I am lifting security on messages received. This is being done in order that all senior officers may fully acquaint themselves with the situation, in readiness for any emergency. This should have enough deflationary effect to stop them from making that particular kind of fool of themselves, don't you think? But won't they just say that you must have destroyed the relevant messages? She objected. Oh, that one won't do. There's service procedure. They will be able to compare my file with the code sections files, and that with the radio section's logbook, and they'll find they all tie up. She went on, studying him. I still don't understand why our missiles have not been launched, she said. No? Well, perhaps all will be revealed to us one day. In the meantime, suppose we just go on obeying our orders. It's really much simpler. But I am extremely grateful to you, Ellen. I had not thought it had got so far yet. Let's hope that tomorrow will show, if not a great change of feeling, at least a less awkward choice of scapegoat. And now, if you will excuse me, I will send for those two. As the door closed behind her, he continued to stare at it for fully a minute. Then he flipped over a switch and requested the presence of his subcommanders. With the interview over, Trun allowed a few minutes for the officers to get clear. They had gone off looking a little winded, one carrying the message file, the other his signed authority of access to the code files in a bemused way. Then, feeling the need for a change, he too left his room and made his way to the entrance port. In the dressing room, the man on duty jumped to his feet and saluted. Carry on, Hughes, Trun told him. I'm going outside for an hour or so. Yes, sir, said the man. He sat down and resumed work on the suit he was servicing. Trun lifted his own scarlet pressure suit from its pegs and inspected it carefully. Satisfied, he shed his uniform jacket and trousers and got into it. He carried out the routine checks and test. Finally, he switched on the radio and got an acknowledgement from the girl at the main instrument desk. He told her that he would be available for urgent calls only. When he spoke again, his voice reached the duty man from a loudspeaker on the wall. The man got up and moved to the door of the smaller, two-man airlock. An hour, you said, sir? He inquired. Make it an hour and 10 minutes, Trun told him. Yes, sir. The man set the hand of the reminder dial 70 minutes ahead of the clock. If the station commander had not returned, or had failed to notify an extension by then, the rescue squad would automatically be summoned. The duty man operated the lock, and presently Trun was outside, a vivid splash of colour in the monochrome landscape, the only moving thing in the whole wilderness. He set off southward, with the curious lilting moonstep which long service had made second nature. At half a mile or so he paused, and made a show of inspecting one or two of the missile pits there. They were, as they were intended to be, almost invisible. The top of each shaft had a cover of stiff fibre which matched the colour of the ground about it. A scatter of sand and stones on top made it difficult to detect, even at a few yards. He pottered from one to another for a few minutes, and then stood looking back at the station. It was dwarfed and made toy-like by the mountains behind it. The radar and radio towers, and the sun bowls looking like huge artificial flowers on the top of their masts, gave a rough scale, but for them it would have been difficult to judge whether the station itself was the size of a half-inflated balloon or half a puffball. It was hard to appreciate that the main body was 120 yards in diameter at ground level until one looked at the corridors connecting it with the smaller storage domes and remembered that the roofs of those corridors were 4 feet above one's head. Trun continued to regard it for some moments. Then he turned around, pursued a zigzag course between the missile pits, and when he was hidden from the station by a rocky outcrop, sat down. There he leaned back and, in such modified comfort as the suit allowed, contemplated the prospect dominated by the bright segment of Earth, and also the shape of the future in a world ruined by war. All his life, and for the matter of that, all his father's life too, the possibility of such a war had lurked in the background. Sometimes it had seemed imminent, but there had been rapprochement. Then again, it had seemed inevitable, but in one way or another it had been avoided. Again and again the tensions had increased and relaxed. There had been conferences, concessions, compromises, bluffs, crises, and occasional panic moves. But through them all, the taper had somehow been kept at a safe distance from the touch-hole. 3 years ago, when he had once more, and certainly for the last time, managed to stave off grounding, he had felt an increased sense of imminence. It was difficult to be sure that the placidity of his spells on the moon did not give a distorted impression that life at home was becoming more febrile and exhausting each leave, but of one thing he was convinced. He had no intention of spending his retirement in one of the regions that grew tense with the jitters 2 or 3 times every year. It was for that reason he had sold his house, the house that had been presented to his mother in tribute to the memory of his father, and moved his family 4,000 miles to a new home in Jamaica. Ridding himself of the house had been satisfactory in another way too, for to him it had symbolized the superhuman obligation of living up to his father's legendary reputation. It had been a solidification of the shadows that his father had unwittingly cast over him since he was 12 years old. Looking back on his life, it was only those years before he was 12 that appeared sunlit and halcyon. He, his mother, and his grandfather had then lived quietly and happily in a roomy cottage. They had their friends and neighbours. He had his own school friends in the village. Beyond that small circle they had been, except for his grandfather's reputation as a classical scholar, unnoticed and unknown. And then, in the September of his 13th year, had come the breakup. A man called Talents had somehow stumbled across the story of Trun and the missile, and had applied to the authorities for the lifting of the security ban. After 12 years, there was no good reason for silence, and, indeed, had been none for some time. 4 satellite stations had for several years been known to be in position, the British one, 2 fair-sized Russian ones, and the huge American one. The existence of space mines was no longer a secret, nor was the fact that all the stations now carried means to combat them. Talents, therefore, had managed to carry his point and, presently, to produce his book. It was a good book, and the publishers spared nothing on the publicity that launched it. The conveniently timed citation of a posthumous VC for Trun helped too, and the book went straight into the epic class. It sold by the 100,000s. It was seized upon by translators at once, and went into all languages save those allied with the intransigent 6th, where it was believed that the space station was a Soviet invention. It was filmed, televised, digested, and strip-treated until, a year later, there was scarcely a man, woman, or child outside the Soviet Empire who did not know of Trun and his exploit. For his son, it had been all very exciting at first, suddenly to discover that one had a hero father, to be invited to big parties, to have news writers and cameramen besieging, to take the seat of honour at a premiere, to be introduced on platforms were great thrills. Soon, however, he had become awkwardly conscious of his ignorance, and of people's disappointment when their talk of space meant nothing to him. To overcome that, he had begun to read books on astronomy and spacework. In them, he learnt that his grandfather had not been fully informative in teaching him that the Pleiades were the 7 daughters of Atlas, that Venus emerged from the sea, that Orion was the great hunter who met his match in Diana. And as he read, he too had seemed to hear the far gnat voices cry, star to faint star across the sky. The excitement of being a public figure had soon worn off. The sense of being watched became distasteful. The feeling that he was expected to be exceptional weighed upon him at school, and only slightly less when he went up to Oxford. The house that his mother had accepted with a feeling of reluctant obligation never had the quality of home that there had been in the cottage. His mother seemed to be forever socially busy now. His new interests were not shared by his grandfather. It seemed impossible to remain unreminded for an hour that he was the son of Trun, and that was rather like finding one had Sir Francis Drake, Lord Nelson, or the National Gallery for a father. His discovered fascination with the problems of space made it worse, as if a part of him had turned traitor and conspired to draw him away from his old interests and deeper into his father's shadow. He had tried hard to retain the belief that Phoebus Apollo was more interesting than Phoebus, the eye of heaven, that Mars, as the alias of the roughneck son of Zeus and Hera, had more significance than Mars, the nearest and potentially most attainable of the planets, that Aristotle, the peripatetic, was of more importance than the crater on the moon that had been named after him, but in vain. An unquenchable curiosity had sprung alight in his mind, and presently he had been forced to admit that though his father's qualities might be beyond him, he had certainly inherited his one passionate interest. With that once decided, he had been willing to set about using his name to further it, and he had entered the service. He had at first used it quite diffidently. He did not seek publicity, that was not necessary, but neither did he shun it any longer. He avoided the cheaply sensational, but he was not unaware that more restrained publicity was gradually building him into a somebody in the public mind. When the press asked for his opinion on spatial questions, he gave it, with careful consideration, and he was in a strong enough position to cause trouble over any misrepresentations. He adopted a deliberate policy, and, little by little, by the time he was 25, he had built the space hero's son into the ordinary man's oracle on space. He did not do it without arousing jealousies, but his popular position was solid, his discretion carefully judged. He was known to work hard. He saw to it that his service record was good. He knew that his opinions had started to carry weight. Trun's first brush with the politicians had followed the announcement, a premature announcement, in point of fact, that the Russians were about to set up a moon station. The immediate effect of this was that the Americans, who had gotten into the habit of regarding the moon as a piece of US bespoken real estate that they would get around to developing when they were ready, were shocked into intense activity. The press wanted, as usual, to know Lieutenant Trun's views on the situation. He had them ready, and they made their first appearance in a responsible Sunday newspaper with an influential circulation. He was well aware of the situation. A moon station was not a thing that could be set up for just a few £1,000,000. It could not but entail an expenditure that the government would be alarmed to contemplate, and he knew that the official policy would be to discourage any suggestion of a British moon station as a frivolous and profligate project, minimizing or brushing aside all arguments in its favor. In his short article, Trun had mentioned the advantages to strategy and to science, but had dwelt chiefly upon prestige. Failure to establish such a station would be a turning point in British policy. It would amount to the first concrete confession that Britain was content to drop out of the van. That, in fact, it was now willing to admit itself as a second or third-rate power. It would be public confirmation of the view, held in many circles for some time now, that the British had had their day and were dwindling into their sunset, that all their greatness would soon lie with that of Greece, Rome, and Spain in their past. Trun's first carpeting over the matter was by his CO. He then trod a number of ascending carpets until he found himself facing a somewhat pompous undersecretary, who began, as the rest had done, by pointing out that he had broken service regulations by publishing an unapproved article, and then worked round by degrees to the suggestion that he might, upon reconsideration, find that a moon station had little strategic superiority to an armed satellite station, and that if the Americans and Russians did build them, they would be wasting material and money. Moreover, I am able to tell you confidentially, the Undersecretary had added, that this is also the view of the American authorities themselves. Indeed, sir, said Trun. In that case, it seems odd that they should be doing it. They would not be, I assure you. But for the Russians, clearly the moon cannot be left entirely to Russian exploitation. So, as the Americans can afford to do it, they are doing it in spite of their views on its worth. And since they are, it is not necessary for us to do so. You think, sir, that it will do us no harm to be seen standing on American feet instead of on our own in this enterprise? Young man, said the Undersecretary severely, there are many pretensions which are not worth the price they would exact. You have been unpatriotic enough to suggest in print that our sun is setting. I emphatically deny that. Nevertheless, it has to be admitted that whatever we have been, or whatever we may be, we are not at present one of the wealthier nations. We cannot afford such an extravagance for mere ostentation. But if we do keep out of this, sir, our prestige cannot fail to suffer, whatever arguments we may advance. As for the American denial of strategic value, I have heard it before, and I continue to regard it as wool-pulling. A moon station would be far less vulnerable and could mount vastly greater firepower than any satellite station. The Undersecretary's manner had become cold. My information does not support that statement, nor does the policy of the government. I must therefore request you. Trun had heard him out politely and patiently. He knew, and he was sure that the Undersecretary must know too, that the damage already done to the declared policy was considerable. There would be a campaign for a moon station, certainly, even if he were publicly to reverse his views, or even if he were to remain silent. The newspapers would enjoy tilting at those who had brought pressure to bear on him. He had only to behave circumspectly for a few weeks while the campaign gathered force, to refuse to give opinions where he had been ready to give them before, and, perhaps, look a little rueful in his silence. There would have been a campaign in some of the popular papers in any case. The main effect of his making his views known early was that in the public mind he appeared as the moon station's most important advocate. In a few weeks, feeling among the electors had become clear enough to worry the government and produce a rather more conciliatory tone. It was conceded that a British moon station might be considered, if the estimates were satisfactory. The prodigious size of the estimates which were produced, however, came as a shock which sharpened the divided opinions. At this point, the Americans took a kindly hand. They had apparently changed their views on the value of the moon stations, and, having done so, felt that it would be advantageous for the West to have 2 such stations to the rival's 1. Accordingly, they offered to advance a part of the cost and supply much of the equipment. It was a generous gesture. Good old Uncle Sam, said Trun when the offer was announced. Still the genial patron with 2 left feet? He was right. There was a considerable body of opinion to demand. Whose moon station is this supposed to be anyway? Nevertheless, the number of noughts to the cost remained intimidating. Presently, there was a rumor in circulation that the wrong kind of thinking, to put it at its least slanderous, was going on at high levels, that there was actually in existence a scheme by which a station could be established at a cost very considerably under half the present estimates, and that Trun, son of Trun, thought well of it. Trun had waited quietly. Presently he found himself again invited to high places. He was modestly surprised and could not think how the proposal came to be connected with his name, but as a matter of fact, well, yes, he did happen to have seen a scheme. Oh, no. It was quite an error to think it had anything to do with him. A complete misunderstanding. The idea had been worked out by a man called Flanderis. It certainly had some interesting points. Yes, he did know Flanderis slightly. Yes, he was sure that Flanderis would be glad to explain his ideas. The American and Russian expedition seemed, insofar as their claims had ever been sorted out, to have arrived on the moon simultaneously, the former landing in Copernicus, the latter in Ptolemy, both claiming priority, and both consequently announcing their annexation of the entire territory of the moon. Experience with the satellite stations had already shown that any romantic ideas of a pax coalestis should be abandoned, but as each expedition was highly vulnerable, both concerned themselves primarily with tunneling into the rock in order to establish strongholds from which they would be able to dispute their rights with greater confidence. Some 6 months later, the smaller British expedition set down in the crater of Archimedes, with the Russians 600 miles away beyond the Apennine Mountains to the south, and the American 400 miles or so to the northeast. There, in contrast with their intensively burrowing neighbors, they proceeded to establish themselves on the surface. They had, it was true, one drilling machine, but this, compared with the huge tunneling engines of the others that had cost a good many times their weight in uranium to transport, was a mere toy which they employed in sinking a series of 6-foot diameter pits. The Flanderis dome, essentially a modification of domes used in the Arctic for some years, was a simple affair to erect. It was spread out on a leveled part of the crater floor, coupled with hoses and left to inflate. With only the light gravity of the moon weighing down its fabric, the outer casing was fully shaped at a pressure of 8 pounds, earth, per square inch. At 15, it was perfectly taut. Then the contents of the various rockets and containers went into it through the airlocks, or the annuli. The air-regenerating plants were started up, the temperature controls coupled, and the work of building the station inside the dome could begin. The Americans, Trun recalled, had been interested. They reckoned it quite an idea for use on a moon where there did not happen to be any Russians about, but on one where there were, they thought it plain nuts and said so. The Russians themselves, he remembered with a smile, had been bewildered. A flimsy contrivance that could be completely wrecked by a single old-fashioned HE shell was in their opinion utter madness and a sitting temptation. They did not, however, yield to the temptation, since that would almost certainly precipitate untimely action by the Americans. Nevertheless, the presumption of a declining power in arriving to settle itself blandly and unprotected in the open while two great powers were competing to tunnel themselves hundreds of feet into the rock was a curious piece of effrontery. Even a less suspicious mind than the Russian could well have felt that there was something here that was not meeting the eye. They instructed their agents to investigate. The investigation took a little time, but presently the solution forthcame, an inconvenient clarification. As had been assumed, the pits that the British had been busily drilling at the same time that they built their station into the dome were missile shafts. This was similar to the work being done by the other two parties themselves, except that where the Americans also used pits, the Russians favored launching ramps. The more disturbing aspect of it came to light later. The British system of control, it appeared, was to use a main computing engine to direct the aim and setting of any missile. Once the missile had been launched, it was kept on course by its own computer and servo systems. The main computer was, unlike the rest of the station, protected in a chamber drilled to a considerable depth. One of its more interesting features was that in certain conditions it was capable of automatically computing for and dispatching missiles until all were gone. A quite simple punched card system was used in conjunction with a chronometer, each card being related to a selected target. One of the conditions which would cause this pack of cards to be fed to the computer was a drop in the station's air pressure. 15 pounds per square inch was its normal, and there was allowance for reasonable variation. Should the dome be so unfortunate, however, as to suffer a misfortune sufficient to reduce the air pressure to 7 pounds, the missile dispatching mechanism would automatically go into action. All things considered, it appeared highly desirable from the Russian point of view that the Flanders dome should not suffer any such misadventure. During the years that had intervened between the establishment of the station and his succeeding to command of it, Trun had taken part in a number of expeditions. Some, such as that which had visited the Apennines, had consisted of 14 or 15 men travelling with their supplies on tractors, surveying, mapping, photographing as they went, spending their sleeping periods in small Flanders domes holding several men, where they could remove their pressure suits to eat and attain some degree of comfort. Others, ranging further, were 2, 3 or 4-man trips on jet-borne platforms. Tractor operations were limited by the huge cracks which radiated from the crater to form impassable obstacles, many of them more than 100 miles in length and a mile wide. The cracks were at most times awesome clefts of unknown, inky depth. Only when the sun was overhead, or shining up their length, was one able to see the rocky debris which choked them several miles below, and it was only at such times that the geologists turned selenologists were able to take their jet platforms down and make their brief notes while the light lasted. Trun, who had rapidly become something of a selenologist himself, had nursed from the time of the landing an ambition to see and record something of the moon's other side. According to rumor, the Russians had, within a year of their arrival, sent an ill-fated expedition there, but the truth or otherwise of the report remained hidden by the usual Slav passion for secrecy. It was one of Trun's regrets that exploration would have to wait on further development of the jet platforms, but there was no reason to think that the invisible side held any surprises. Photographs taken from circling rockets showed no more than a different pattern of the same pieces, mountains, seas, and craters innumerable. The regret that exploration must fall to someone else was no more than minor. Most of what he had wanted to do, he had done. The establishment of the moon station was the end to which he had worked, maneuvered, and contrived. He had given Flanders the idea of the dome and helped him to work it out, and, when that looked like being rejected for its vulnerability, he had briefed another friend to produce the solution of automatic reprisals which they had called Project Stalemate. It was better, he had thought then, and still thought, that the affair should appear to be a composite achievement rather than a one-man show. He was satisfied with his work. He had almost reconciled himself to handing over the command in another 8 months, with the thought that the station's future was secure, for however much it might be begrudged as a charge on the armed forces, the discovery of rare elements had given it practical importance. The astronomers attached great value to the station, and the medical profession, too, had found it useful for special studies. But now, there had come this war, and he was wondering whether that might mean the end of all the moon stations. If this one survived, would there be the wealth or even the technical means left to sustain it when the destruction was finished? Was it not very likely that everybody would be too busy trying simply to survive in a shattered world to concern themselves with such exotic matters as the conquest of space? Well, there was nothing he could do about that. Nothing but wait and see what the outcome was, and be ready to seize any opportunity that showed. And it was still possible that there might be no one left on the moon by the time it was over. The signs were that the two giants had felled one another already. One could do no more than hope that the threat of Project Stalemate would continue to ward off attack by the Russian satellite stations if they were still in working order. After all, the descent of some 70 fission and fission-fusion bombs on one's country would seem, even though that country was spread over 1/6 of the habitable globe, to be a heavy price to pay for the destruction of one small moon station. Yes, given luck and some sense of relative values in the enemy's mind, the British moon station still had quite a chance of survival. Trun got up and walked out from behind the rock. He stood for some moments, a lone scarlet figure in the black and white desert, looking at his moon station. Then, picking his path carefully between the missile pits, he made his unhurried way back to it. At the end of dinner, he asked if he might have the pleasure of the doctor's company at coffee in his office. Looking at her over the rim of his cup, he said, "It would seem to have worked." She regarded him quizzically through her cigarette smoke. "Yes, indeed," she agreed, "like a very hungry bacteriophage. I felt as if I were watching a film speeded up to twice natural pace." She paused and then added, "Of course, I am not familiar with the usual reactions of commanding officers who have been suspected of treason and stood in some danger of lynching, but one would not have been surprised at a little more, perturbation?" Trun grinned, a bit short on self-respect. He shook his head. "This is a funny place, Ellen. When you have been here a little longer, your own sense of values will seem a little less settled." "I have suspected that already." "But you still need to get the measure of it. My immediate predecessor once said, 'When I am on this singularly unheavenly cinder, I make it an invariable rule to assume that the emotional content of any situation is 75% above par.' I don't know how he arrived at the 75, but the principle is entirely right. You know, you yourself weren't far off sharing the general opinion this morning. It gave you a sense of the dramatic, an angle for the feeling of tension, and helped to relieve the boredom of the place. You would not have felt like that at home, and I should not have behaved as I did at home. But here, the occasions for standing firm and for bending are different. Technically, I am the CO, with all the authority of the Crown behind me, and because of that, we preserve certain forms. In practice, my job is more like a patriarch's. Sometimes rank and regulations have to be invoked, but we find it better to use them as little as we can." "I have noticed that too," she agreed. "We realized when we came here that there would be particular problems, but we could not foresee all of them. We realized that we'd need men able to adapt to life in a small community, because they would be restricted almost all the time to the station. We had them vetted for claustrophobic tendencies too. But it did not occur to anyone that, out here, they would have to contend with claustrophobia and agoraphobia at the same time. Yet it is so. We are shut in a vast emptiness. It made a pretty grim mental conflict for a lot of them, and morale went down and down. After a year of it, the first station commander began to battle for an establishment of women clerks, orderlies, and cooks. His report was quite dramatically eloquent. "If this station," he wrote, "is required to keep to its present establishment, then, in my considered opinion, a complete collapse of morale will follow in a short time. It is of the utmost importance that we take all practical steps which will help to give it the character of a normal human community. Any measures that will keep this wilderness from howling in the men's minds, and the horrors of eternity from frostbiting their souls, should be employed without delay. Good Lyceum stuff, that, but true all the same. There was a great deal of misgiving at home, but no lack of women volunteers. And when they did come, most of them turned out to be more adaptable than the men. And then, of course, the patriarchal aspect of the CO's job came still more to the fore. It is no sort of a place for a disciplinarian to build up his ego. The best that can be done is to keep it working as harmoniously as possible. I have been here long enough to take its pulse fairly well as a rule. But this time, I slipped up. Now, I don't want that to happen again, so I'd be glad of your further help to see that it doesn't. We've dislodged this particular source of trouble, but the causes are still there. The frustrations are still buzzing about, and soon, they're going to find a new place to swarm. I want the news early, the moment they look as if they have found it. Can I rely on you for that?
But seeing that the cause, the immediate cause, that is HQ's failure to use us, I don't see that there is anything here for them to concentrate the frustration on.
Nor do I. But since they cannot reach the high brass back home, they will find something or other to sublimate it on. Believe me.
Very well. I'll be your ear to the ground. But I still don't understand. Why? Why doesn't HQ use these missiles? We know we should be plastered, wiped out in an attempt to put the main computer out of action, but most of the men are past caring about that. They have reached a sort of swashbuckling, Gotterdammerung state of mind by now. They reckon that their families, their homes, and their towns must have gone, so they are saying, what the hell matters now? There is still just a hope that we are being reserved for a final, smashing blow, but when that goes, I think they'll try to fire them themselves.
Trun thought a little. Then he said, I think we have passed the peak of likelihood of desperate action. Now that they are sure that no firing orders were received, they must, most of them, swing over to the proposition that we are being conserved for some decisive moment, with the corollary that if our missiles are not available when they are called for, the whole strategy of a campaign could be wrecked. After all, could it not come to the point where the last man who still has ammunition holds the field? For all we can tell, we may at this very moment be representing a threat which dominates the whole situation. Someone could be saying, unconditional surrender, now. Or, we'll bomb you again from the moon. If so, we are rather an emphatic example of, they also serve.
Yes, she said after reflection. I think that must be the intention. What other reason could there be?
Trun looked thoughtfully after her as she left. Her predecessor would have spread such a theory, offered as her own, all round the station in half an hour. He was not quite sure yet how much Ellen talked and who listened to her. However, that would soon reveal itself. In the meantime, he turned to the day's reports and spent an hour filling in the station's log and his own private log. Before leaving the office, he went over to the window again. The scene had not changed greatly since morning. The crater floor was still harsh in the sunlight of the long lunar day. The cut-out mountains looked just the same as they had for 10 million years. The nacreous earth had moved only a few degrees and still hung with the night line half across her face, and the other half veiled. Presently he sighed and turned towards the door of his sleeping cabin. The jangle of the bedside telephone woke Trun abruptly. He had the handpiece to his ear before his eyes were well open.
Radar watch here, sir,
said a voice with a tinge of excitement behind it.
2 UFOs observed approaching southeast by south. Height 1,000, estimated speed under 100.
2 what? Inquired Trun, collecting his wits.
Unidentified flying objects, sir.
He grunted. It was so long since he had encountered the term that he had all but forgotten it. You mean jet platforms? He suggested.
Possibly, sir.
The voice sounded a little hurt. You've warned the guard?
Yes, sir. They're in the lock now.
Good. How far off are these, UFOs?
Approximately 40 miles now.
Right. Pick them up televisually as soon as possible and let me know. Tell switchboard to cut me in on the guards link right away.
Trun put down the telephone and threw back the bed covers. He had barely put a foot on the floor when there was a sound of voices in his office next door. One, more authoritative than the rest, cut across the babble.
0, boys. Open her up.
Trun, still in his pajamas, went through to his office and approached his desk. From the wall speaker came the sound of breathing and the creak of gear as the men left the lock. A voice said, "Damned if I can see any bloody UFOs. Can you, Sarge?"
That,
said the sergeant's voice patiently, "is southeast by south, my lad." "Okay, but I still can't see a bloody UFO. If you—"
Sergeant Whitley,
said Trun into the microphone. A hush fell over the party.
Yes, sir. How many are you?
6 men with me, sir.
6 more following.
Arms?
Light machine gun and 6 bombs each man, sir. 2 rocket tubes for the party.
That'll do. Ever used a gun on the moon, Sergeant?
No, sir.
There was a touch of reproof in the man's voice, but one did not waste ammunition that had cost several pounds a round to bring in. Trun said, "Put your sights right down. For practical purposes, there is no trajectory. If you do have to shoot, try to get your back against a rock. If you can't do that, lie down. Do not try to fire from a standing position. If you haven't learnt the trick of it, you'll go into half a dozen back somersaults with the first burst. All of you got that?" There were murmured acknowledgements. "I don't for a moment suppose it will be necessary to shoot," Trun continued. "But be ready. You will not initiate hostilities, but at any sign of a hostile act, you, Sergeant, will reply instantly, and your men will give you support. No one else will act on his own. Is that clear?"
"Yes, sir."
"Good. Carry on now, Sergeant Whitley." To a background sound of the sergeant making his dispositions, Trun hurried into his clothes. He was almost dressed when the same voice as before complained. "Still, I don't see no bloody—" "Yes, I do though, by God! Something just caught the light to the right of old Mammoth Tooth. See?" At the same moment, the telephone rang. Trun picked it up. "Got the telly on them now, sir. 2 platforms. 4 men on one, 5 on the other. Scarcely any gear with them. Wearing Russian-type suits, headed straight this way." "Any weapons?" "None visible, sir." "Very well. Inform the guard." He hung up and listened to the sergeant receiving and acknowledging the message, while he finished dressing. Then he picked up the telephone again to tell the switchboard, "Inform the WO's mess that I shall observe from there, and switch the guard link through to there right away." He glanced at the looking-glass, picked up his cap, and left his quarters with an air of purpose, but carefully unhurried. When he arrived at the WO's mess on the southeast side, the 2 platforms were already visible as shining specks picked out by the sunlight against the spangled black sky. His officers arrived at almost the same moment and stood beside him, watching the specks grow larger. Presently, in spite of the distance, the clear airlessness made it possible to see the platforms themselves, the pinkish-white haze of the jets supporting them, and the clusters of brightly colored spacesuits upon them. Trun did not try to judge the distance. In his opinion, nothing less precise than a rangefinder was any use on the moon. He clicked on the hand mic. "Sergeant Whitley," he instructed, "extend your men in a semicircle and detail one of them to signal the platforms down within it. Control, cut my guard link now, but leave me link to you." "Guard link cut, sir." "Is your standby with you?"
Yes, sir.
Tell her to search for the Russian intercom wavelength. It's something a little shorter than ours as a rule. When she finds it, she is to hold it until further notice. Does she speak Russian?
Yes, sir.
Good. She is to report at once if there is any suggestion of hostile intention in their talk. Cut me in on the guard link again now. The two platforms continued smoothly towards them, dropping on a long slant as they came. The sergeant's men were prone, with their guns aimed. They were deployed in a wide crescent. In the middle of it stood a lone figure in a suit of vivid magenta, his gun slung, while he beckoned the platforms in with both arms. The platforms slowed to stop a dozen yards short of the signaller, at a height of some 10 feet. Then, with their jets blowing dust and grit away from under them, they sank gently down. As they landed, the space-suited figures on them let go of their holds and showed empty hands.
One of them is asking for you, sir. In English, Control told him.
Cut him in, Trun instructed.
A voice with a slight foreign accent and a trace of American influence said,
Commander Trun, please allow me to introduce myself. General Alexei Gudenkovich Beduriev of the Red Army. I had the honor to command the moon station of the USSR. Commander Trun speaking, General.
Did I understand you to say that you had that honor?
He gazed out of the window at the platforms, trying to identify the speaker. There was something in the stance of a man in a searing orange suit that seemed to single him out.
Yes, Commander. The Soviet moon station ceased to exist several Earth days ago. I have brought my men to you because we are very hungry.
It took a moment for the full implication to register, and then Trun was not quite sure.
You mean you have brought all your men, General?
All that are left, Commander. Trun stared out at a little group of 9 men in their vivid pressure suits. The latest intelligence report, he recalled, had given the full complement of the Russian station as 356. He said, Please, come in, General. Sergeant Whitley, escort the General and his men to the airlock. The General gazed round at the officers assembled in their mess. Both he and his aide beside him were looking a great deal better for 2 large meals separated by 10 hours of sleep. The lines of hunger and fatigue had left his face, though signs of strain remained.
Gentlemen, he said, I have decided to give you an account of the action of the moon station of the USSR while it is fresh in my mind, for several reasons. One is that I consider it a piece for the history books, and for the military experts too. Another is that although it appears to have brought the campaign in this theater to a close, the war still continues, and none of us can tell what may happen to him yet. With this in mind, your commander has pointed out that knowledge carried in a number of heads has a better chance of survival than if it is restricted to 2 or 3, and suggested that I, who am in a better position to give the account than anyone else, should speak to you collectively. This I am not only honored, but glad to do, for it seems to me important that it should be known that our station fell to a new technique of warfare, an attack by dead men. He paused to regard the faces about him, and then went on. What you call, in English, the booby trap, something which is set to operate after a man has left it, or is dead, a kind of blind vengeance by which he hopes to do some damage still. That is nothing new. It is, one would imagine, as old as war itself, but a means by which dead men can not only launch but press home an attack. That, I think, is new indeed. Nor do I yet see where such a development may lead. He paused again and remained so long looking at the table in front of him that some of his audience fidgeted. The movement caught his attention, and he looked up. I will start by saying that,
To the best of my knowledge, all life that still exists upon the moon is now gathered here, in your dome. Now, how did this come about? You are no doubt aware in outline of the first stages. We in the American station opened our bombardment simultaneously. Neither of us attacked the other. Our orders were to disregard the American station and give priority to launching our earthbound missiles. I have no doubt that their orders were similarly to disregard us. This situation persisted until, of our heavy missiles, only the strategic reserve remained. It might well have continued longer had not the Americans, with a light missile, destroyed our incoming supply rocket. Upon this, I requested and received permission to attack the American station, for we had a second supply rocket already on the way and hoped to save it from the same fate. As you know, the use of heavy ground-to-ground missiles is not practicable here, nor would any attempt to use our small reserve for such a purpose have been permitted. We therefore retaliated with light missiles on high-angle setting to clear the mountains round the Copernicus crater. Again, as you will know, the low gravity here gives a wide margin of error for such an attempt, and our missiles were ineffective. The Americans attempted to reply with similar missiles, and they, too, were highly inaccurate. There was slight damage to one of our launching ramps, but no more. Then, one of our satellite stations, which chanced to be in a favorable position, dispatched 2 heavy missiles. The first they reported as being 2 miles off target. For the second, they claimed a direct hit. This would seem to be a valid claim, for the American station ceased at once to communicate, and has shown no sign of life since. A reprisal attack on our own station from the American satellite was to be expected, and it came in the form of 1 heavy missile which landed within a mile of us. Our chief damage was fractures in the walls of the upper chambers, causing a considerable air leakage. We had to close them off with bulkheads, while we sent men in spacesuits to caulk the larger fissures and spray the walls and roofs with plastic sealing compound. The area of damage was extensive, and the work was hampered by falls from the roof, so that I decided to remain incommunicado in the hope of attracting no more missiles until we stopped the leaks. It was to be hoped, too, that now the satellites had been brought into the action, ours might succeed in crippling the American with their wasps by the time we had made good. "Wasps?" somebody interrupted. "You haven't heard of them?" I'm surprised. However, it can do no harm now. They are very small missiles, used in a spread-out flock. A satellite can easily meet 1 or several ordinary missiles with counter-missiles and explode them at a safe distance. But with missiles that come to the attack like a shoal of fish, defense is difficult, and some will always get through, or so it is claimed. "And did they, General?" Trun asked. He gave no indication of knowing that the British satellite, which his father had helped to construct, was disabled, and nothing had been heard from the American satellite since the second day of hostilities. The general shook his head. "I cannot say. By the time we had our leaks repaired and our mast up again, there was a message from HQ saying that it had lost touch with our satellites." His earlier formality had ceased, and he went on more easily, as a man telling his story. "We thought then that we had, as you say, come through, but it was not yet certain that there would be no further attack or that more cracks in the roof might not open, so we kept our suits handy. That was very fortunate for some of us. 5 Earth days ago, that is 4 whole days after the American station was hit, the man on television watch thought he caught a glimpse of something moving among the rocks on the crater floor to the north of us. It seemed improbable, but he held the masthead scanner on the area, and presently he caught another movement, something swiftly crossing a gap between 2 rocks, and he reported it. The duty officer watched too, and soon he also caught a snatch of movement.
but it occurred too rapidly for him to be sure what it was. They switched in a telephoto lens, but it reduced the field of view and showed them nothing but rocks. So they went back to the normal lens just in time to see what looked like a smooth rock appear from the cover of one of the ordinary jagged rock and slither behind another. At this point, the duty officer reported to me, and I went down to join them in the main control chamber. Viewing conditions were difficult on account of the crosslight. The dawn had only begun the previous Earth day, so that the shadows gave dark bars of cover, but anything that moved in the sunlight also threw a long shadow to catch the eye. After a few minutes watching, I had to agree that something, though I could not distinguish what, was moving out there, apparently in sharp, sudden dashes. Once, it paused in the open. We hurriedly cut in the telephoto lens again, but before we could focus, the thing had flashed away and become invisible in a dark patch. We alerted the guard to stand by with rocket tubes and went on watching. The thing kept on dodging about, suddenly shooting out of a black shadow, or from behind a rock and vanishing again. There was no doubt that it was gradually coming closer, but it seemed in no hurry to reach us. Somebody said, "I think there must be two of them. The appearances and disappearances were so erratic that we could not be sure." We tried radar on it, but at that angle and among so much broken rock, it was practically useless. We could only wait for the thing to reach more open ground and show itself more clearly. Then there was report from the guard of another moving object, somewhat further west. We turned the scanner that way and observed that there was indeed a similar something there that dodged about among the rocks and shadows in the same unidentifiable way. Over an hour went by before the first of them reached the more open ground at a range of 11 kilometers from us. But even then it was some time before we could get a real idea of it, for it was too small on the normal lens to show detail and too erratic for the telephoto to follow it. Before long, however, there were 3 of the things all skirmishing wildly about the crater floor with sudden rushes forward, sideways, any direction, even back, and never staying still long enough for us to make them out clearly in the crosslight. If our armament had included short-range bombardment missiles, we should have used them at the first sighting. But they were not a weapon that had seemed reasonable equipment for a moon station, and we could only wait for the things to come within practicable range of the portable rocket tubes. Meanwhile, they continued to dash hither and thither, zigzagging madly about the crater floor. It was uncanny. They made us think of huge spiders rushing back and forth, but they never froze as spiders do. Their pauses were no more than momentary, and then they were off again, and one never could tell which way it would be. They must have been traveling quite 30 or 40 meters to make an advance of 1 meter, and they were in an extended line so that we could only get one, or perhaps for a moment 2 of them, on the screen at the same time. However, during the time it took them to cover the next 2 kilos, we were able to get better views and impressions of them. In appearance, they were simple. Take an egg, pull it out to double its length, and that is the shape of the body. Put long axles through it near the ends, and fasten tall, wide-tired wheels on them, tall enough to give it a good ground clearance. Mount the wheels so that they have 180 degrees of traverse, that is, so that the treads can be turned parallel with the lines of the axle. Whether the wheels themselves are before or behind the axle, and you have this machine, it can move in any direction or spin in one spot if you want it to. Not perhaps very difficult once you have thought of the idea. Give it a motor in each wheel and an electric control to keep it from hitting obstacles. That is not very difficult either. What is not so clear is how you direct it. It was not very clearly by dead reckoning. We thought it might be responding to our radio, or to the rotation of our radar scanner, or to the movements of our television pickup. But we tested all those, and even switched off our screen for some minutes. But the guard outside reported no effect, nor was it detecting and seeking any of our electric motors. We stopped every one of them for a full minute, without any result. It was just possible that the things were picking up an emanation from our power pile, but that was well shielded, and we already had decoy radiators to deflect any missiles that might try that. I myself think it probable that they were able to detect and respond to the inevitable slight rise of temperature in the station area. If so, there was nothing we could have done about it. The general shrugged, shook his head, and frowned. He went on, "What we faced, in essence, was a seeking missile on wheels. Not difficult to construct, though scarcely worth attempting for use in a simple form. Too easy a target for the defense. So what those Americans had done, the frightening thing they had done, was to introduce a random element. You see what I mean? They had put in this random stage and somehow filtered the control through it." He thought again for a moment. "Machines do not live, so they cannot be intelligent. Nevertheless, it is in the nature of machines to be logical. The conception of an illogical machine seems to be a contradiction in terms. If you deliberately produce such a thing, what have you? Something that never existed in nature, something alien. What you have done is to produce madness without mind. You have made unreason animate and set it loose. That is a very frightening thing to think about. But here, among these not-quite machines that were scuttering about the crater floor like water boatmen on a pond, there was a controlling thread of ultimate purpose running through the artificial madness. Their immediate actions were unpredictable, insane, but their final intention was just as sure as the bomb that each was carrying in its metal belly. Think of a maniac, a gibbering idiot, with one single continuing thread of intention: to murder. That is what those machines were, and they kept on coming with short, or very short, or not so short, crazy rushes. They darted and dodged forward, sideways, backwards, obliquely, straight, or in a curve. One never knew which would be next, only that, after a dozen moves, they would be just a little closer. Our rocket men opened fire at about 5 kilos. A sheer waste, of course. One could as well have hoped to hit a fly on the wing with a pea shooter. Mines might have stopped them, if they did not have detectors. But who would have sanctioned the use of valuable rocket space to bring mines to the moon? All our men could do was to hope for a lucky shot. Occasionally, one of them would be hidden for a moment or two by the burst of an explosion, but it always reappeared out of the dust, dodging as crazily as ever. Our eyes and heads ached with the strain of trying to follow them on the screen and to detect some pattern in their movements. I'm sure myself that no pattern existed. At 3 kilos, the men were doing no better with their shooting and were starting to show signs of panic. I decided that at 2 kilos, we would withdraw the men and get them below. The things kept on coming, as madly as ever. I tell you, I have never seen anything that frightened me more. There was the dervish-like quality of the random madness, and yet the known deadly purpose. And all the time there was the suggestion of huge, scuttering insects, so that it was difficult not to think of them as being in some alien way alive. Some of the rocket bursts did succeed in peppering them with fragments now and then, but they were not harmed. As they approached the 2 kilo line, I told Colonel Zinacek here to withdraw the patrol. He picked up the microphone to speak, and at that moment, one of the things hit a rocket bomb. We saw it run right into the bomb. The explosion threw it off the ground, and it came down on its back. The diameter of the wheels was large enough to allow it to run upside down. It actually began to do so, but then there was a great glare, and the screen went blank. Even at our depth, the floor of the chamber lifted under us, and cracks ran up 2 of the walls.
I switched on the general address system. It was still live, but I could not tell how much of the station it was reaching. I gave orders for everyone to put on spacesuits and stand by for further instructions. One could hope that the explosion of one machine might have set off the others, but we could not tell. They might have been shielded at the moment, or even if they were not, either or both of them might have survived. Without air, there is not the usual kind of blast and pressure wave. There is flying debris, of course, but what else? So little work has been done on the precise effects of explosions here. Our mast had gone again, so that we were without radar or television. We had no means of telling whether the danger was over, or whether the machines were still scurrying about the crater floor like mad spiders, still working closer. If they were, we reckoned that it should take them about 35 minutes to reach us at their former rate. No half hour in my life has been as long as that one. Once we had our helmets on and the intercoms were working, we did our best to learn what the damage was. It appeared to be fairly extensive in the upper levels, for there were few replies from there. I ordered all who could to make their way down to the lowest levels and to stay there. Then there was absolutely nothing we could do but wait and wait, wondering if the things were indeed still skirmishing outside and watching the minute hand crawl round. It took them, exactly 31 minutes. The whole place bounced and threw me off my feet. I had a glimpse of cracks opening in the roof and walls, then the light went out, and something fell on me. I don't need to go into details about the rest. 4 of us in the control chamber were left alive, and 5 in the level immediately above. None of us would have survived had the rock had earth weight, nor should we have been able to shift it to clear a way to the emergency exit. Even so, it took us 4 Earth days to dig our way through the collapsed passages. All the station's air was gone, of course, and we had to do it on dead men's air bottles and emergency rations, as long as the rations lasted, and with 1 2-man inflatable chamber between us to eat in. The emergency exit was, of course, at some distance from the main entrance, but even so, a part of the roof of the terminal chamber had fallen in and wrecked one of the platforms there. Fortunately, the other 2 were scarcely damaged. The outer doors of the airlock were at the base of a cliff, and though the cliff itself had been a shield from the direct force of the explosion, a quantity of debris had fallen in front of the doors so that we had to blast them open. That gave us a big enough opening to sail the platforms through and avoid any radioactive contamination, and, I think, by reason of the airlock's position, any serious exposure to radiation ourselves. He looked round the group of officers. "It has been chivalrous of you, gentlemen, to take us in. Let me, in return, assure you that we have no intention of making ourselves a liability. On the contrary, there is a large food store in our station. If the cisterns have remained intact, there is water. Also, there are air regeneration supplies, but we need drilling gear to get at these things. If, when my men are rested, you can let us have the necessary gear, we shall be able to add very considerably to your reserves here." He turned to the window and looked at the shining segment of earth. "And that may be as well, for I have a feeling that we may be going to need all the supplies we can collect." When the meeting was broken up, Trun took the general and his aide along to his own office. He let them seat themselves and light cigarettes before he said, "As you will understand, General, we are not equipped here to deal with prisoners of war. I do not know your men. Our station is vulnerable. What guarantees can you give against sabotage?" "Sabotage?" exclaimed the general. "Why should there be sabotage? My men are all perfectly sane, I assure you. They are as well aware as I am that if anything should happen to this station, it must be the end of all of us. But might there not be one? well, let us call him a selflessly patriotic man who might consider it his duty to wreck this station even at the cost of his own life. I think not. My command was staffed by picked, intelligent men. They are well aware that no one is going to win this war now, so that the object has become to survive it. But, General, are you not overlooking the fact that we here are still a fighting unit, the only one left in this theater of war? The General's eyebrows rose a little. He pondered Trun for a moment, and then smiled slightly. I see. I have been a little puzzled. Your officers are still under that impression? Trun leaned forward to tap his cigarette ash into a tray. Perhaps I don't quite understand you, General. Don't you, Commander? I am speaking of your value as a fighting unit. Their eyes met steadily for some seconds. Trun shrugged. How high would you place our value as a fighting unit, General? General Baduriev shook his head gently. Not very high, I am afraid, Commander, he said, and then, with a touch of apology in his manner, continued. Before the last attack on our station, you had dispatched 9 medium missiles. I do not know whether you have fired any more since then. Therefore, the total striking power at your disposal may be either 3 medium missiles or none at all. Trun turned and looked out of the window towards the camouflaged missile pits. His voice shook a little as he asked, May I inquire how long you have known this, General? Gently, the General said, About 6 months. Trun put his hand over his eyes. For a minute or two, no one spoke. At length, the General said, Will you permit me to extend my sincere congratulations, Commander Trun? You must have played it magnificently. Trun, looking up, saw that he was genuine. I shall have to tell them now, he said. It's going to hurt their pride. They thought of everything but that. It would, I think, be better to tell them now, agreed Baduriev. But it is not necessary for them to know that we knew. Thank you, General. That will at least do something to diminish the farcical element for them. Do not take it too hard, Commander. Bluff and counter-bluff are, after all, an important part of strategy, and to have maintained such a bluff as that for almost 20 years is, if I may say so, masterly. I have been told that our people simply refuse to believe our agents' first reports on it. Besides, what was our chief purpose here? Yours, mine, and the Americans? Not to make war. We were a threat which, it was hoped, would help to prevent war, and one fancies that all of us here did do something to postpone it. Once fighting was allowed to start, it could make really very little difference whether our missiles were added to the general destruction or not. We have all known in our hearts that this war, if it should come, would not be a kind that anyone could win. For my part, I was greatly relieved when I received this report on your armament. The thought that I might one day be required to destroy your quite defenseless station was not pleasant. And consider how it turns out. It is simply because your weapons were a bluff that your station still exists, and because it exists that we have still a foothold on the moon. That is important. Trun looked up. You think so too, General? Not very many people do. There are not, at any time, many people who have, what do you call it in English? Divine discontent? Vision? Most men like to be settled among their familiar things with a notice on the door. Do not disturb. They would still have that notice hanging outside their caves if it were not for a few discontented men. Therefore, it is important that we are still here. Important that we do not lose our gains. You understand? Trun nodded. He smiled faintly. I understand, General. I understand very well. Why did I fight for a moon station? Why did I come here and stay here?
to hold on to it so that one day I could say to a younger man, "Here it is. We've got you this far. Now go ahead. The stars are before you." Yes, I understand. But what I have had to wonder lately is whether the time will ever come for me to say it. General Baduriev nodded. He looked out, long and speculatively, at the pearl blue earth. Will there be any rocket ships left? Will there be anyone left to bring them? He murmured. Trun looked in the same direction. With the pale earth light shining in his face, he felt a sudden conviction. "They'll come," he said. "Some of them will hear the thin gnat voices crying. They'll have to come. And one day, they'll go on."